Star Wars creator George Lucas made an appearance at the Cannes Film Festival in France last week, and he had some pretty harsh comments for the Walt Disney Company and how modern day Lucasfilm is treating Star Wars. Before we get to this, I'd like to ask you please hit that subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos here at the Trent Report. Wrote this up over at thatparkplace.com. And indeed, George Lucas blasted the Walt Disney Company for not understanding the franchise and story, as well as not understanding the Force. During this appearance at the Cannes Film Festival last week, the Hollywood Reporter detailed that Lucas informed a crowd, "I was the one who really knew what Star Wars was, who actually knew this world, because there's a lot to it. The Force, for example, nobody understood the Force." He added this: "When they started other ones, after I sold the company, a lot of the ideas that were in the original sort of got lost, but that's the way it is. You give it up, you give it up." So, strong words there from George Lucas, calling out the Walt Disney Company, its executives, Bob Iger. One has to assume Kathleen Kennedy, Dave Filoni, maybe even Jon Favreau, for not understanding Star Wars and clearly not understanding the Force. This isn't unheard of from George Lucas. He's actually famous for criticizing Disney for its treatment of Star Wars after he sold the company and the franchise to them back in 2012. Ahead of the release of The Force Awakens in 2015, Lucas described Disney as white slavers. He said, "These are my kids, all the Star Wars films. I love them. I created them. I'm very intimately involved in them. I sold them to the white slavers that take these things." And unfortunately, Charlie Rose cut him off there. So we didn't get to actually hear what he was going to say. I would have loved to have heard what he was going to say there, but Charlie Rose cut him off in order to stop Lucas from continuing to disparage the Walt Disney Company and Lucasfilm for what they were doing to Star Wars before The Force Awakens released in 2015. And as we know, that film ended up being basically a soft reboot of the original Star Wars. They basically just aped all of the plot points, all of the story ideas from the original Star Wars film, and reskinned a number of the characters and called it a sequel. And then from there, they just completely butchered all of the canon and the rules that Lucas had set for the films in back in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, with The Last Jedi and like Yoda coming down and like Force lightning, the temple, Force ghosts interacting with the Force, Luke catching the lightsaber, physical objects, Luke catching the lightsaber in Rise of Skywalker. The whole like you can transfer items with the Force through time and space that we saw with like Rey and Kylo Ren. All this like absolutely ridiculous, stupid, garbage ideas that they have introduced. Obviously, the massive power increase that Dave Filoni gave I can't remember the character's name now, so forgettable, from Star Wars Rebels and Ahsoka. She's like the Mandalorian character, but she gets this like massive power boost just when the plot needs it, so she can fight off these Thrawn undead soldiers. But we also have this here from Disney CEO Bob Iger. He actually admitted that Lucas felt betrayed by Disney in his book, The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company. After detailing how Lucas had written a number of outlines for a sequel trilogy, how Iger and the Walt Disney Company made sure to purchase them and then chose to go in a completely different direction from them with a sequel trilogy, Iger said, "Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed. And while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start." I think that's probably, I don't think he's exaggerating there. That's probably an understatement, if anything, when George Lucas is describing your company as white slavers. We also had this from October 2020. He answered a question from 7th grader Jeremiah during an appearance at the East Harlem School at Exodus House. Jeremiah asked, "The world has changed so much since the first Star Wars movie. How do you think the changes? How do you think the changes in the fight for racial justice will impact the Star Wars universe going forward?" Lucas answered this. Let's just take a listen here.
I've kind of lost control of Star Wars, so it's going off in a different path than what I intended. But the first 6 are very much mine and my philosophy.
So there you go. He says the first 6 are very much mine and my philosophy. I've kind of lost control of Star Wars, so it's going on in a different path than what I intended. So very clear that not a fan of the sequel trilogy, does not really recognize them as the core of Star Wars, and are completely kind of maybe even contrary to his philosophy that he espouses through the first 6 films. And it's highly likely that Lucas's conception of Star Wars and the Force will continue to be maligned by Disney in its upcoming The Acolyte series. Actress Amanda Stenberg told Empire this, that the show is set in, quote, a time in the galaxy where the way people use the Force is in canon. It's very expansive. It doesn't necessarily have the more rigid conceptions that it might have later in the Galactic Republic. So they're clearly changing the Force and how it is used, changing the rules for the galaxy, basically. She goes on, so that provides us the opportunity to maybe explore the different way this character relates to the Force. So again, changing the rules, which they've kind of already done in the High Republic in the novels. But again, not many people were reading that. I think there was like significant decline in sales over time for that. But they're now bringing this into live action and fully canonizing it on the silver screen here, the small screen. I also think Lucas's comments here that he made at the Cannes Film Festival, I think they confirm that Dave Filoni is not the apprentice of George, which is something that Lucasfilm was trying to do. They were pushing this narrative that Dave Filoni was George's apprentice. They did this back in September when they were promoting the Ahsoka series. They released a featurette that saw the Mandalorian creator Jon Favreau recalling a set visit from Lucas. And he said, George visited this set when we were filming the lightsaber fight in the Japanese garden in season 2. So he's recalling Mandalorian season 2 with Ahsoka. And he said this, and I think he was really encouraging of Dave stepping up to this role. And so George would turn to Kathy and myself and be proud of Dave. He was Dave's teacher and Dave was his apprentice. Well, that doesn't really make any sense when you have George Lucas literally saying, what does he say? He says, a lot of the ideas in the original sort of got lost. The Force, for example, nobody understood the Force. That includes Dave Filoni. That includes Jon Favreau. So this idea that Jon Favreau, Lucasfilm are pushing that Dave Filoni is somehow George's apprentice, George seems to be rebuking that in this latest appearance at the Cannes Film Festival. He's already made comments about this before. Back in the early 2000s, he said this when asked if he wanted Star Wars to continue after he passed away. He says, no, I've worked it out to where when I do it in terms of the films that I'm doing, this will be the last. The next film, 3 will be the last film, and it'll be a 6-part series, and that'll be the end of it. Obviously, he did indeed write outlines for future films. He did indeed get himself involved in the animated feature film as well, the Clone Wars, and he was somewhat involved in the Clone Wars animated television series as well. But in the same interview with CNN back in the early 2000s, he was also asked if he was mentoring anyone, and he said this, no, there may be other venues for it, but not in the theatrical release, but for sort of offshoot stories and things in other areas, but not in theatrical films. I just want to keep that special. I don't want to have it sort of turn into Star Trek. So he made it very clear that he was not kind of mentoring anyone or having anyone be his apprentice, as Jon Favreau made out in that featurette. So I think these are pretty damning comments by George Lucas about the current state of Lucasfilm and how the Star Wars franchise has been treated by the Walt Disney Company, by Bob Iger, by Kathleen Kennedy, by Jon Favreau, by Dave Filoni. Does not like what it looks like. He thinks that they have completely misunderstood what he created with Star Wars, and clearly saying that they do not understand it and they do not understand the Force. But those are my thoughts on this. Let me know what you guys make of this. What do you make of what George Lucas had to say here? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to always be charitable, especially to each other, but to always speak the truth.